So, a Terraria mod came out very recently advertising itself as a mod that turns Terraria into a roguelike game. I thought it looked cool when I saw the trailer, so I decided to give it a try, and it's amazing. 10 out of 10 mod. So I thought today I'd take a break from making videos about my own mod, Forgotten Evils, and make a full review for TerRoguelike. In this review, I'll mostly be gushing about how great the mod is, but I'll also be talking about a few things that I think could be improved, because although this mod is already amazing, it has the potential to be so much better. But before we get to that, if you haven't heard, 100% of my viewers are subscribed, so if you're watching this video and you haven't subscribed yet, then you don't exist. So let's start with the basic premise of the mod. You need to kill the Moonlord, and to reach him you need to go through 5 procedurally generated dungeons. Throughout these dungeons you'll fight hordes of enemies, fight unique bosses, and get upgrades that'll help you become strong enough to fight the big bad himself. Right away, one of this mod's big strengths becomes pretty apparent, which is how accessible it is. Starting a new Terraria world can be a daunting task. You need to build, you need to explore, you need to fight, you gotta strategize, and do all of these things for hours and hours to get the best out of the game, and sometimes it just doesn't seem worth the trouble. But if you want to play TerRoguelike, all you have to do is just boot up the game and start playing. It's really simple, and you're immediately tearing through enemies, fighting bosses, and getting lots of cool upgrades. In fact, with me working so much on Forgotten Evils, the only reason I even considered playing this mod is because I could see all it had to offer within a few hours, which also is one of its bigger weaknesses, but we'll talk about that later. Now let's talk about the level design. It's great. As said before, there are 5 floors that you need to get through to reach the Moonlord, and each one can have one of 2 biomes depending on RNG, which adds some nice run variety. The dungeons themselves consist of linear sequences of rooms randomly selected and filled with enemies. Each room needs to be cleared of enemies before you can move on to the next one, and at the end of the dungeon there's always a boss fight. The majority of the enemies and bosses use OG Terraria sprites, but they all have completely new AIs to better suit the roguelike playstyle. And I gotta say, running through these procedurally generated dungeons that use lots of Terraria's blocks and decor and have unique takes on familiar enemies is really refreshing. Terraria offers a lot of tools to make really cool looking builds, but you never see those in a Terraria world unless you make one yourself. But the nature of this mod allowed for the creators to make some really cool looking environments, and the enemies fit right in, and it all just feels very authentic. The portals that lead to new areas, the barriers that keep you trapped in the rooms, and the smooth animations when enemies spawn in all go to show that this was not done lazily. The developers really poured all their efforts into making this a true roguelike experience, and they nailed it. But enough about the level design. Let's talk about the combat. The enemies are done really well. Most of them follow the same idea as their vanilla counterparts, but they're executed much differently to make them less of a nuisance and a lot more engaging. Also, they turn the ballista from the Dungeon Defenders 2 event and the Morningwood pet into enemies, which I think is really cool. As the player, you start the game with a gun, a sword, and a double jump as if you had a cloud in a bottle, but you don't. I don't really like the sword. It does a lot of damage, but you have to charge it up for ages to get good use out of it, and then get really close to the enemies, most of which deal contact damage. Your main weapon is most likely going to be the gun, which has infinite ammo, infinite range, decent rate of fire, and moderate damage. Not too crazy by itself, but this is where the upgrades come in. Upgrades constitute the roguelike aspect of the game, and one is given to you every time you complete a room at random, and they come in the form of items that can be picked up and stored in your inventory. These items give various different effects while in your inventory. To pick a few examples, some can make you heal when you kill enemies, others can increase your mobility by giving you extra speed or more double jumps, but the most important ones in my opinion are the weapon upgrades, which increase the damage and agency of your sword and gun. These can do all sorts of things, like increasing your crit chance, increasing your flat damage, increasing rate of fire, giving you certain bonuses when you're close to enemies, making your attacks bounce, and a lot of other things. And it's a lot of fun getting these upgrades and then tearing through hordes of tough enemies on the later levels. It really feels like you're getting stronger and making significant progress. And of course there are the bosses, all of which, save for a few exceptions, are amazing. They're super creative and are a pretty healthy balance between fair and challenging. My favorite is probably the boss of the Living Wood area, which turns a pretty forgettable mini-boss from the Pumpkin Moon into a really cool boss fight with some pretty creative attacks. The final boss is also pretty awesome, with a few surprises that you won't see coming. I don't want to spoil too much, but on the topic of that, I would like to talk about this section where you have to run backwards through the whole game. Basically, you're on a time limit and you have to run back through all the dungeons you cleared to get this far, and that's pretty genius, as it keeps the final boss sequence from being exactly the same every time, as the enemies you have to face on the way back will be affected by how the dungeon generated up to this point. Now that we've talked about everything I like about the game, let's talk about some of its flaws. I believe the biggest flaw with this masterpiece is that it has very little replay value. The game's not that long, and it's not all that difficult either. There's only one potential boss fight for each biome, and only 2 possible biomes for each floor. Which is to say, by the time you reach the final boss and beat it, you've probably already seen most, if not all, this game has to offer. There aren't really that many upgrades either when you consider the fact that you get one upgrade every time you finish a room, so you probably have seen all of them by the time you complete the game too. This is a huge problem since roguelikes usually are known for having lots of replay value. This is usually accomplished by adding more optional difficulties, secret and unlockable content that can be found even after you've completed the game, and just making a full run a lot longer and harder. If you can pretty easily beat the game if you just try, then there's really not much reason to come back. On the other hand, if it's super hard and unpredictable, you will feel motivated to come back and try different strategies and just see if you're up to the challenge this time. What I would do to fix this is make the game a lot longer and less forgiving, adding more floors and bosses. Make it so that just seeing a new floor is a reward in its own, and when you finally do reach the Moon Lord, there's a massive amount of thrill because you know just how much you'll have to go through again just to reach it. To balance this out, you might make it so that there are fewer upgrades on each floor, say maybe one every other room. That way you wouldn't have a million by the time you finally reach the end. And it added a lot more room for certain enemies, bosses, and biomes from vanilla Terraria to be added. I really love to see what the creators could do with stuff like the Shimmer, or the Marble biome, or even the Sky biome. I also think it'd help a lot with run variety if there were 3 possible bosses for each biome instead of just 1. On that topic, I told myself I'd really like to see the Desert Phantom as a boss in the Sand area, or the Curse Mode Eater of Worlds in the Corruption. So if you're out there, mod creators, and for some reason you'd like to indulge my narcissism, feel free to use my assets. I might even be willing to pay you. I also wouldn't mind seeing the Hive Mind or the Perforators from Calamity make an appearance either. Moving on, another big problem I see with the mod is the lack of strategy. Roguelike games are often well known for their strategy, as you get to choose different items and upgrades to better suit your playstyle. However, here, you're pretty much just given items at random. This gets so that pretty much every time you'll end up with a hybrid build that gives you mobility, durability, and damage without giving you the choice to focus on just one. There are these altar things that let you exchange certain items for other items, but it's just not enough. I think when you complete a room, you should be allowed to choose between 3 different items, maybe one from each different category, and that would allow you to much better customize your gameplay style. Just to be clear, this mod is already amazing, but I do hope that the devs keep working on it because it has a massive amount of untapped potential. I have a lot more ideas, but if I keep talking like this, I'm going to lose my voice, so I'm going to end it here. I'll leave a link to the mod in the description, and you can feel free to go play it, which I highly recommend, and if you like this kind of content, please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you, goodbye.